Greetings, glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace to people of goodwill. Today's date on the Gregorian calendar is September 11th, and aside from being the anniversary of an infamous and terrible tragedy which happened 23 years ago in my own city, it also marks other events. For example, it purportedly marks the victory which the German tribes under Arminius scored against the Romans under Publius Quinctilius Varus at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in the 1st century, basically at the dawn of the Common Era. Beyond that, in most years, it marks the New Year in Ethiopia. So too, in those same years, it marks the New Year for Coptic Christians. And it also marks the birthday of a man who has served as the scourge of Salafi terrorists, the president of the Syrian Arab Republic, Bashar al-Assad.
You know what's interesting about Abu, right? If you do the history on him, I'm not going to put a lot of information out there, but Abu, a Roman Catholic, Muslim, Syria, right? A Syrian, who is have a thing for Assad,
And relevant to this video, this is also the date of an interesting post which our good friend DrKelly Richardson put up on social media. He put it up both on Facebook as well as on his We Woke Now channel on YouTube. And I wanted to mark this date because the very topic he posted on, the topic of this video, was addressed in a short video I posted to Twitter on this date back in 2020. In other words, the good doctor ironically posted on this topic on the 4th anniversary of a tweet which might arguably serve as a rebuttal to what he posted. And I'll share links to all of these posts and, my sources in general in the video description. And so, any interested viewer can check them out and, decide for themselves. But getting to the relevant post from today, our friend from the We Woke Now channel is returning to the entry on Ruddy in the 1915 International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. He's appealed to this multiple times over the years, mainly to discuss how the biblical David looked and how the biblical Esau looked, and from there he attempts to extrapolate to how Israelites and Edomites look in general. But in today's post, he was trying to make a point about how Esther looked, according to the so-called additions to Esther, which is to say the portions of the Septuagint version of Esther which are not found in the Masoretic version of Esther. And I'm actually glad that he posted in reference to Esther because I've long felt that he didn't quite understand this entry, and I felt the portion on Esther in particular exemplified his apparent misunderstanding of the text. But to show this, let's first note what he didn't show from the entry. So look at his quotation of the entry, and now let's look at the full entry. One thing he left out is that the entry states that the relevant Greek verb which is used in that verse in Esther means to blush. And with that in mind, let's look at the translation he was appealing to, which was the King James Apocrypha. When you look at the 1611 edition of this text, note that there are 2 lines beside the word ruddy. That marking directs the reader to a marginal note. And when you look for the marginal note for that verse, it reads, quote, or rose-colored, end quote. So in what sense did the King James translators mean ruddy? It's clear from this marginal note that they understood it along the lines of being the color of a rose, which is to say red. The translators of the 1611 King James Apocrypha understood the relevant Greek verb, which can mean to blush, as referring to Esther as being rose-colored. Perhaps we could even say rosy-cheeked, if you will. But there's more. Let's look at verse 7, which states that when the king looked fiercely in the direction of Queen Esther, she fainted and was pale. So this ruddy or rose-colored girl, this apparently rosy-cheeked girl, fainted, and that rose color apparently drained from her face, at which point she became pale. And verse 13 makes clear that she fainted and turned pale because she was afraid. So with that, let's return to that entry. Now, as a disclaimer, I'm not saying you have to agree with this entry, but the fact nonetheless remains that it's lumping the descriptions of Esau and David together with the description of Esther in the Septuagint. And if we actually understand what this entry is stating, it conflates the appearance of Esau and David with the appearance of a blushing, rosy-cheeked girl who turned pale when afraid. Now again, I'm not saying you have to agree with that. I'm not saying that you're required to think that the historical Esau or the historical David look like the Septuagint depiction of Esther. But that is nonetheless the implications of this very entry, which our friend over at the We Woke Now channel has appealed to multiple times. Now, our friend has often appealed to this entry mainly because of what it states at the end. Quote, the dark-skinned Hebrews found great beauty in a clear complexion, end quote. However, I must confess, I wonder if he understands what he's reading there. For example, does he realize that this is intended as a contrast? The quote-unquote clear complexion, that's not my choice of terminology, that's what the entry states, but the quote-unquote clear complexion is being contrasted with the darker complexion, which the author insinuates was more typical of Hebrews. That quote-unquote clear complexion referred to that type of red complexion, that type of blushing or rosy cheek complexion, the type of complexion of people who might turn pale when they faint. Nonetheless, if we were to agree with this entry, it would speak to a diversity of looks within the Hebrew spectrum, with dark-skinned folks and lighter-skinned folks capable of blushing. And even without that entry, common sense alone should have told us such a spectrum was practically obvious. And so too, the genetic evidence implies something similar about a spectrum of looks in the region. And all of that makes a mockery of infantile attempts to say who is or is not a Hebrew today based on their outward appearance. But before one can even make a meaningful attempt at that, they first need a clear definition of Hebrew. And I'm sorry, but with all due respect, I feel our friend over at the We Woke Now channel no longer has a coherent or clear definition of such. He used to affirm a patrilineal definition, but he seems to have jettisoned that without offering a clear alternative. C'est la vie. But with that, I'll close this video here. As always, I welcome any comments, questions, or criticisms. You see, unlike the We Woke Now channel, comments are not censored here. So feel free to share your thoughts, whether positive or negative, and God bless.